Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's way. Episode 6. One Creation, Two Creation. Philo on Genesis. Now that we know the life and times of the genius Philo, it's time to get down to brass tacks. And there is no better place to start understanding Philo's thought than at the very beginning, with his account of Genesis. The first question Philo wants to tackle in this work is a famous one. If you have read the book of Genesis lately, then you may have noticed that Genesis tells the story of the world's creation not once, but twice. We get a very nice and seemingly complete summary of the world's origins in Genesis 1. Then the author starts all over again, tells the same story again with just enough differences to confuse you, and refuses to elaborate. Now the question of why this book is written this way has vexed biblical interpreters of every age. Nowadays, the most common answer to that question is something called the documentary hypothesis. Basically, the documentary hypothesis states that the author of Genesis didn't write the book all in one go. Instead, the author, if that's what we can call them, stitched together multiple earlier stories to create Genesis. The idea is that Israel had two creation stories, not one, and both were deeply loved by the people who grew up on them. So rather than pick one over the other, the author of Genesis just put them next to each other in the text and called it a day. That's why they called it the documentary hypothesis, because the idea was that there were documents, stories, behind each of those creation accounts in Genesis. As you might imagine, there is a lot we could say about the documentary hypothesis. I'm not going to say any of that today. That's best left to Old Testament scholars. I merely bring it up to show you how different Philo's approach is. Philo assumes that every jot and tittle of the scriptures is inspired. God had more up the divine sleeve than just copy-pasting old stories together. For Philo, if there are two creation stories, then that means there must have been two creations. He's sort of like a hobbit, but with creations instead of breakfasts. Yes, we've had first creation, but what about second creation? For Philo, the first thing that God makes is not the physical world. The first thing God makes is the world of ideas or forms. Remember from the last main episode that these ideas or forms are basically the templates of individual beings. You can think of God kind of like a good architect. First he makes the blueprint, then he makes the building. Now, this gets complicated in the text because Philo talks about both first and second creation in Genesis 1, but in general, he prefers to talk about Genesis 1 as being about the blueprint of creation. So let's talk about that blueprint. Philo's thoughts about the intelligible creation are found in a couple of places, but I'm going to focus on a work that he called, fittingly enough, On the Creation of the World. This work opens with Philo talking about how the book of Genesis is just the best, real A-plus level stuff. It's awesome for many reasons, several of which Philo will deign to elaborate for us. The first is that it pairs very nicely with the rest of the Torah. For Philo, if you want to give people a law, it helps to first get them to understand the universe, which allows them to comprehend the reasons behind particular laws. So Genesis does a fantastic job of setting up the rest of the Bible. It's also nice in that it has some nice stories without being so dense as to be incomprehensible, at least incomprehensible to Philo. But most of all, Genesis will have absolutely no truck with two ideas that are dumb and wrong. The first is the idea that the world was not created at all, but is eternal. Philo has a big target in his sights here. He is criticizing the philosophy of Aristotle, which was profoundly influential in Philo's day, as it still is in ours. Aristotle argued that the world had to be eternal for reasons that sound awfully familiar today. He pointed out that matter is neither created nor destroyed. It changes its form a lot, but every new thing that comes to be does so out of pre-existing matter. Aristotle reasoned from this that it was impossible for matter to come out of nothing. You always needed some kind of pre-existing substrate of stuff that could be formed into particular things. So if matter can't come into existence, then the only way the world exists is because the matter we have around has always been here. So the world is eternal. QED. Some of Aristotle's defenders came up with other arguments for the world's eternity too. They were not as good as Aristotle's arguments because, well, they weren't Aristotle. But they were interesting arguments nonetheless. Take, for example, one Critolaus, a Stoic philosopher who argued that it wasn't only matter that was indestructible, it was species as a whole. The human species had always existed, so Critolaus thought, and always would. For Critolaus, this was not an accident. The world exhibited a fundamental and perfect order. To gain or lose a species would disrupt that order. Thus, the world had to be eternal. Of course, we know differently today. Turns out evolution disrupts other worldviews besides fundamentalist Christianity. Who knew? In Simeon's wake, now brought to you by Schadenfreude. Now, Philo has two beefs to pick with this doctrine of the world's eternity. It's not so much a problem of finding the point in time that God started making the world, or to date the age of the earth with precision. Philo thinks time is a measure of change and duration, so there really isn't any time until we have a material world at all. No, Philo is upset that people don't recognize that the world is a creation, which means they transfer the honor that is due to God to the world. For Philo, God is fundamental and perfect order par excellence. To give that honor to the world is not only extremely rude, it's impious. Philo's second beef, and this is the other fundamental insight of the early chapters, is that God is still involved with God's creation. This is also a big difference from Aristotle. Aristotle also believed that there was a supreme God, but that God is far too perfect and blessed and immutable and happy to have anything to do with the boring old world. No, God is doing something much better. God is thinking about himself all the time. Since God is perfect blessedness, there is literally nothing better to think about than himself. God's involvement in the world would really only bum God out. And looking at the world today, I'm inclined to say, same. Philo, however, notes that one really great incentive to virtue is believing that God cares what's happening in the world and is working to advance the cause of righteousness. So Aristotle's version of an unmoved mover cuts off the life of virtue at the knees. Of course Aristotle wants people to be virtuous, but he wants them to do it for them. And that is, alas, just not enough motivation for some folks. Instead, Philo argues that a God who is fully and completely good must be involved with creation, because the nature of goodness is to share itself with those around it. Think about it. When someone is good, they tend to share what they have with others. That's just part of what goodness involves. Now, God is ultimately good. So God should both give as much as is possible and should give the best that is possible. And what is the best thing that one could possibly give? Well, it's God. Because after all, divine being is supreme blessedness and beauty and joy itself. And this, for Philo, is the real reason for creation. You might wonder why, on Philo's account, God bothered to make a world at all. I mean, maybe the world of the ideas and forms is kind of nice, but of course those were made with the intent of creating a material world full of disgusting things like flesh-prisoned bodies and confusion and evil and oatmeal raisin cookies trying to trick you into thinking they're chocolate chip cookies. Ugh. Philo insists that creation is in the end good. And it is good precisely because of this. It has the potential to be filled with the gifts of God. He puts it beautifully, and I quote, For while of itself matter was without order, without quality, without soul, it was full of inconsistency, ill adjustment, disharmony. But it was capable of turning and undergoing a complete change to the best, the very contrary of all these, to order, quality, life, correspondence, identity, likeness, and perfect adjustment to harmony. Now God determined it was appropriate to confer rich and unrestricted benefits upon that nature, which apart from divine bounty could obtain of itself no good thing. End quote. So God wants to give creation everything it can possibly receive. But the capacity to receive depends upon the nature of the thing. For example, the difference between the best and the worst human being is pretty big. The difference between a saint and Adolf Hitler is quite capacious. And the difference between an angel and the fallen angel Lucifer is even bigger. But the difference between a rock that has received God's gifts and a rock that hasn't is probably not much. I mean, I don't know how you even tell. Maybe there's a rock out there with a little halo and wings that glows and stuff. That'd be kind of fun. But I think, and Philo thinks, that a rock can't receive as much from God as a human can. So God gives to each thing according to its capacity. Now, this may raise a question for you. If God wants to give as much as possible, then why make things that can't receive God optimally? In other words, why make a bunch of rocks that can't know God? Why not make more angels instead? Or why not just make the forms and leave it at that? Philo doesn't answer that question, but I suspect there are a few things he could say. First, he could point out that human life relies on other forms of life. People need rocks to stand on and plants to eat and water to drink. So if you're going to make a human, you need to make that stuff whether you want to or not. Second, I think Philo assumes that God wants to fill the universe with all different kinds of being. Maybe a rock can't know God, but a rock can exist, and to exist is still better than not to exist. So to give as much goodness as possible, God would make a whole bunch of stuff that exists, not just the most intellectual stuff. And before you say, okay, but if that's true, then why did God make so much empty space where nothing exists? Hush! Space is not empty. Every inch of space is brimming with energy. There is an energy inherent in space-time, and energy is equivalent to matter, so the universe is actually quite full. It's not quite full of the kind of stuff you recognize as stuff, but that's your problem, not God's. Anyway, that was me talking, not Philo. I just got really excited because I could use my physics degree there for a second. Okay, back to the plot. Now that Philo has established the rationale for creation, it's time to talk about making the cool stuff. God makes the invisible heaven and the pattern of the earth and the form of water and breath. How do you know that God has made these? Well, because Genesis says that in the beginning God began to create heaven and earth, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Now, this cannot mean that the earth was already hanging out before God started to create it. That would be silly. No, it means that God was creating the invisible templates for each of these things. And if you weren't convinced of that, Philo will remind you of God's famous words, "Let there be light." Now, notice that according to Genesis, God has not yet created the sun, the moon, the stars, or anything of that sort. God creates light, but there is as of yet no light source. For Philo, this is more evidence that God is creating the template of light, the invisible light, from which all light comes, and from which the sun, moon, and stars draw their brightness by participation. Furthermore, God separates the light from the darkness. In other words, God defines the concepts of light and dark. And then the text says, "There was evening and there was morning the first day." Or at least that's what your Bible probably says. Philo's Bible read a little bit different. It said, "There was evening and there was morning one day." For Philo, this is exactly right, because God is not creating physical days. There is nothing in the universe yet to even have a day. God has, alongside light and dark, created the idea or template of a day. Okay, so that's enough about the world of forms. You probably get a sense of what Philo is doing here. Now it's time to turn to the world we actually live in, which means we are switching over from On the Creation of the World to the allegorical interpretation of Genesis. Of course, the book called On the Creation of the World is an allegorical interpretation of Genesis, so whoever was in charge of naming Philo's works had an interesting sense of style. But anyway, on to work number 2, which is about Genesis chapter 2 and the material world created therein. And that world is all about numbers, man. Like, whoa. Philo starts by noting the fact that the world was created in 6 days. Now, did you think that the Bible said that because the world was created in 6 days, it was created in 6 24-hour periods? Ha ha! No. Genesis describes a 6-day creation because 6 is a perfect number, obviously. Now, why is 6 a perfect number? Lots of reasons. It is the first number that is equal to the product of 2 unequal prime numbers. 2 times 3 equals 6. And before you ask, no, 1 is not a prime number. To be a prime number, you have to have a common factor other than 1. But there are other reasons why it's perfect. The sum of its own fractions adds up to 1. 1/2 plus 1/3 plus 1/6 equals 1. Now, I don't quite understand Philo's logic here. I don't understand how you can exclude 1/4 and 1/5, but he does it. Even better, the number 6 is made up of the numbers 2 and 3, which have their own significance. 2 signifies the world of plurality and materiality, and the world has 3 dimensions. Even better, if you want to move around, you have 6 options. You can move forward, backward, upward, downward, right, or left. The upshot of this mathematical tour de force is that 6 is the appropriate number for material things. Philo tragically misses out on the other reason why 6 is the perfect number, because 7 is a cannibal. How do we know this? Because 7, 8, 9. But, more to the point, Philo tells us this is how we know that Genesis 2 is talking about the creation of the material world. Happy and blessed things, often meaning spiritual things, are associated with the Sabbath, which happens on the 7th day. The ordinary material world corresponds to everything 6-like. This may sound to you like Philo ate a few fun mushrooms after his math class and wrote all of this down. But he's actually following an ancient philosophical tradition called Pythagoreanism. It was named for Pythagoras, the Greek philosopher who came up with the Pythagorean theorem you had to memorize in math class. Pythagoras believed that the numbers were the fundamental language of the universe, and that each number had mystical significance. He's really one of the most interesting and understudied guys in the period. In addition to creating the Pythagorean theorem, he also made a number of important contributions to music, and had almost a religious sect that formed around his person. He also believed that beans had souls and therefore you shouldn't eat them, but that part wasn't as influential. Philo took over Pythagoras' numerology and put it to good use. Philo also has a lovely little note here about the creations of God. He says, don't think that God stops creating on the 6th day. No, God is always creating and making. Even when they end, God's creations turn into something new. Human creations stand still when they're done. A pot stays a pot, a painting stays a painting. But when a day ends, a night begins. When one thing dies, it provides the resources for another thing to be born. Philo here quotes a Greek poem. Nothing that's born will ever die. Its severed parts together fly and make another shape. I don't have any big comment to make on that. I just think it's nice. Now, if 6 is the number of material things on Earth, 7 is the number of the sky. There are 7 planets in the sky. Remember, they didn't know about Pluto back then, and they didn't count Earth as one of the planets. And Philo notes that many astronomical phenomena are governed by the number 7, including the constellation Pleiades, which is known as the Seven Sisters. And then, of course, there's the most obvious thing of all, that babies are born after a 7-month pregnancy. Yeah, everybody knows that pregnancies are supposed to last 7 months, and if the baby stays in the womb for 8 months, that's bad. Yeah, a 7-month pregnancy is a normal and totally healthy thing. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by not knowing a thing about the female body. Freud famously said, after exploring the mysteries of the psyche, there was but one thing he didn't know: what women want. Attempting to understand the fairer sex can be difficult, so instead, just don't try. Plug your ears every time they talk about their hormones. Close your eyes around pregnant women. Run off to live in an all-male ascetic community so you will be safe from their cooties. Not knowing a thing about the female body, making philosophy easier and actual women's lives harder since circa 10,000 BC. Okay, now that Philo is done misunderstanding the female body, he gets on to talking about the creation of actual human beings, by which he mostly means the creation of minds and sense perception. He gets this out of Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 and 5, which is the beginning of the second creation narrative. These verses say that God has made every green thing of the field before it appeared on the earth, and all the grass before it sprang up. For Philo, this is the clue that this section is the move from the creation of ideas to the creation of particular realities. I mean, what does it mean to make every green thing before it appears on the earth, besides that you've made the idea or template of it? Now, Philo acknowledges that there is more to the world than the mind and the five senses, but those are his main focus. He notes that the grass and greenery are powerful metaphors for the mind and sense perception. However, something else is required for them to be active. We need particular humans to think and perceive, but more importantly, we need actual things to sense and think about. And those come from God. In a beautiful turn of phrase, Philo says, and I quote, "For the mind by itself is without employment when the cause of all things does not pour down like rain and moisture, colors on the sight, sounds on the hearing, savors on the taste." End quote. This is what God does in the created world, giving the mind and senses a riotous variety of things to turn their attention to. But the greatest gift of all was the breath that God gave to humanity. Well, specifically to the second lower humanity, because just like everything else, God first created the archetypal spiritual humanity and then created, actual humans, with their gross flesh-prison bodies, and with minds that had some communion with the spiritual mind, but also had a tendency to over-focus on the world. Philo then raises a question. How come God gave the divine breath to the second kind of humanity rather than just the spiritual aspect of the human? Why breathe into the flesh prisons? Philo's answer is lovely, and if you remember what he said before about God's generosity, it won't surprise you. He says, and I quote, "God loves to give, and so bestows good things on all, even on those who are not perfect, at the same time encouraging them to a zeal for virtue and a participation in it, by displaying his own overflowing wealth, and how there is abundance even for those who will derive no great benefit from it." End quote. In other words, God wants to give as much as possible. Even if the physically oriented mind has less potential for growth than that first spiritual mind of the human, God still wants it to benefit, and so gives the gift of the divine breath. God gives the body a soul so that the body may come to know God. We can only know God because God has placed a spark of that divine breath in each of us. Once God has made a human being, there has to be some place to plunk it down on earth. Where is that place? If you said the Garden of Eden, you get half credit. Based on some linguistic analysis he does not deign to share with us, Philo says that Eden is an allegorical term for luxury. And what is true luxury? Virtue, as it turns out, because virtue is governed by right reason. He says, and I quote, "Right reason does not set, nor is it quenched, but its nature is ever to rise. Just as the sun, when it has risen, fills the gloom of the atmosphere with light, so virtue also, when it has risen in the snow, illumines its mist and disperses its deep darkness. For God places the mind amid virtue, evidently to the end that as a good gardener, it may spend its care on nothing else but this." End quote. After this lovely bit of symbolism, Philo then proceeds to the obvious next part of the story, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 21. Unbothered by the dreary burden of linear exposition, Philo decides that now would be a good time to answer the question burning in everyone's mind. If God made a garden, how come I'm not allowed to put a garden by an altar of God? I don't know why Philo chose to pose this question now. Maybe the Egyptians were making fun of the Jews for not planting gardens by their altars like all the cool Copts were doing. Maybe Philo had an annoying guy at his synagogue who really liked gardening and wouldn't stop bugging Philo as to why he couldn't put a garden there. But the most likely reason is that Philo had something he wanted to say and needed to find a way to shoehorn it in here. Which, of course, he did. What is it that Philo wants to say so badly? That the soul is not equal to God. God plants and builds virtues in the soul. You can't do that yourself. What kind of virtue seeds do you have? No, the human soul doesn't plant. The soul's job is to be open and receptive to God's activity. And this apparently means we aren't supposed to plant gardens around the altars of God. We should come ready for God to plant virtue in us. Well, at any rate, that's one thing we should do. The other thing we should do is read Genesis and come up with nifty allegories, which Philo continues with force. Eden is said to be the place where 4 rivers meet. The first of these rivers is the Phison, but its actual name is Prudence. Why? Well, because in Greek the word for sparing is phidesthai, which Philo thinks is etymologically related to the Phison. And what spares us? Well, prudence. Prudence is the practical virtue of knowing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to be silent, and so it spares the soul from doing evil. This kind of etymological reasoning is fascinating to me because it only works in Greek. Philo knows perfectly well that the Bible was written in Hebrew, not Greek, and that there's a different Hebrew word for sparing. He knows the Greek Bible he has is translated. And yet he sees the Bible as so inspired, even in its translated Koine Greek, that the linguistic parallels are full of meaning. And boy, do those parallels keep on coming. The next river Genesis mentions is the Gihon, which represents courage because Gihon means breast. Courage is the virtue of the chest. The river Tigris doesn't have any nice etymological parallels, but it flows through the land of Assyria, and in Greek, the word Assyrian means directing. What directs us or tries to? Pleasure. What flows against or out of pleasure? Boom. Self-control. Virtue number 3, allegorized. Then we get the 4th river, the Euphrates, which means fruitfulness. This is a symbol of justice, which brings forth much fruit indeed, gladness in the mind, contentment in society. Now, Philo goes on at length about all these symbolisms, but we have to move on, so I'm not going to run through all that. As you might imagine, God puts the human being in the garden to till it and keep it. Given that these 4 virtues meet in Eden, the tilling and keeping of the garden are symbolic of the man's responsibility to remember and practice these virtues. Now, Philo has done something very, very clever here. You may think that his allegories are not terribly convincing. And yeah, you're right. I'm not convinced by this either. It's definitely not the way people usually reason about the scriptures today. However, the reason we don't find it convincing is because we are not first century Greek-speaking Alexandrines. If you were in Philo's audience, you would have picked up on something very, very interesting. Aristotle famously listed 4 virtues that all people should embody: prudence, self-control, courage, and justice. And what are the 4 virtues that water Eden? Prudence, self-control, courage, and justice. Philo has read out of the biblical story an endorsement of all the virtues that Hellenistic culture prized and that its greatest mind had explored. In a culture that viewed Jews with suspicion and looked down on their religion as primitive and barbaric, that is a big deal. Philo is showing his religion's critics that there is an intellectually respectable way of reading the Jewish Bible. That is a big deal, and in a city where one of the first pogroms broke out, it's potentially a life-saving one. Anyway, back to Genesis. God plunks the humans in the garden and tells them they can eat of all the trees in the garden, but not of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, Philo draws a few conclusions from this. The first is that if Adam and Eve can eat of all the trees in the garden, then the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not in the garden. Now, this presents certain logistical problems. Was the tree just on the other side of the garden fence? How did Adam and Eve get there? But of course, Philo isn't working on a logistical level, he's working on an allegorical level. His point is that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not part of our acquisition of virtue. It's not in the garden of goodness, it is something else. To eat of it is already to venture outside of the virtuous enclosure God has made. This helps to explain the second point. God warns Adam and Eve that on the day they eat of the tree they will die, but of course that doesn't happen. They keep right on living and even have children. Philo explains this with recourse to his two-tiered creation scheme. God's threat of death is not directed at the bodily human, but at the human soul. The soul dies when it becomes trapped in wickedness and evil, because evil is death itself. A natural death is no evil. Philo makes a powerful contrast. And I quote, "Now when we are living, the soul is dead and has been entombed in the body as in a sepulchre. Whereas, should we die, the soul lives forthwith its own proper life, and is released from the body, the baneful corpse to which it was tied." End quote. Oh, Philo, what did your poor body ever do to you? I bet he didn't do well on dodgeball day in gym class. Alright, so much for the tree, at least for now. Next up, Genesis talks about the creation of Eve. And we get that famous line, "And the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone." Why, Philo asks, is it bad for the man to be alone? He gives several answers. The first is that only God is supposed to be alone. God is absolutely and completely one, the sole creator of the universe. God can be alone, but for Adam, to try to be alone is to try and be like God, and that's bad. Aloneness is good for God, but bad for the human. I like to imagine God as a beleaguered introvert, and Adam as his golden retriever extrovert roommate during a COVID lockdown. Adam just won't leave God alone because he has nobody else to be with. Probably not what Philo had in mind, but I like it. The second reason is that the human being is not alone even when there are no other people around. The human being is a multitude. Soul and body, warm parts and cold parts, heavy parts and light parts. We are a community in ourselves. It is fitting that community be modeled between people, not just inside them. Thus, a companion for the human being is made. Now, if you've been following along thus far, you've probably noticed something. All of Philo's allegories seem to end with him saying that everything in the Bible is about virtue. It's good to be good and bad to be bad. Philo was no Michael Jackson fan. The idea of something bad being good never entered his mind. So you might be listening along and thinking, okay, cool. Now Philo is going to find some way to use the creation story to tell me that I should be virtuous and focus on divine truths instead of bodily concerns, right? Believe it or not, wrong. This time, Philo switches gears. Philo believes that the creation of humanity is designed to show us the relationship between mind and sense perception, and that this is especially true in the creation of Eve. Philo reasons as such. First of all, it would be absurd to take this story at a literal level. For starters, God doesn't need to create Eve out of a rib. God could have just made her out of the earth, same as Adam. Moreover, if God really took a rib out of Adam, where is that missing rib? Human men have the same number of ribs as human women. And moreover, Philo asks rhetorically who believes this story is literally true anyway. And that's very interesting. We moderns are sometimes a bit too quick to assume that ancient people were credulous and believed every single miracle story they ever heard literally happened. Philo proves otherwise. By his standards, any educated person, or even just anybody with common sense, should know that this story is an allegory. Therefore, we have to look into the details of the story to understand its hidden meaning. Philo starts by reflecting on the fact that Eve is made from Adam's side. Apparently, in ancient Greek, the sides are a synonym for strength. When you see an Olympic champion, you'd note their strong sides, or you might say of an opera singer that they have good sides. Which means, In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by abs. You do your crunches in the gym, you do your side twists and your cable crunches and your sit-ups. You may even do your V-holds like the legendary Arnold Schwarzenegger. But bro, do you even lift the most important lift of all? Do you lift your holy hands up to God. That's right, don't just let your physical abs be strong. Let your spiritual sides be strong too, so that when this fleshly corpse prison passes away, you can crush weights with all of the angels in heaven. You can drink God's patented manna pre-workout, and you can come to the life of virtue and contemplation that is, of course, the only real strength any of us have. Now, what is the strength or helper of the human mind? It is sense perception. No sooner is the mind created than it needs sense perception to go alongside it and help it. Thus, allegorically, Eve is created right after Adam. Now, Philo is here doing something very interesting. He's taking a stand on one of the oldest debates in the history of philosophy, the relationship between the mind and the senses. To make a very long story very short, philosophers and theologians and psychologists and other certified smart types have long wondered how people come to know things. Does our mind contain innate ideas that come pre-built in our minds? Or do we get all of our ideas from our five senses, from experiencing the world around us and reflecting on it? Both sides of this debate can point to some interesting case studies. Take, for example, math. Even if you didn't like taking math in school, please take it just for example right now. I'm going to try to make this painless. There are lots of mathematical facts out there that we seem to be able to grasp intuitively, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Once you are taught that 2 plus 2 equals 4, you know it is true. And you know this at a very deep level. You know that 2 plus 2 is nothing but the number 4, and that there is no way 2 plus 2 could equal anything other than 4. Now, maybe you needed a teacher to show you that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Maybe you didn't come up with that on your own. But now that you know it, you really and truly know it. You haven't counted up 2 and 2 1,000 times and said, well, it's added up to 4 the last 1,000 times, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to get 4 again this time. No, you simply know it. Philosophers have long been taken by this kind of knowledge. Most famously, Plato said that mathematics was more a matter of remembering what we already know, albeit implicitly, than of learning something new. We don't need to use our senses to learn this, not really. And even if we lived in a universe that didn't have 2 of anything, if we lived in a world that only had 1 of each single thing, it would still be true that 2 plus 2 would equal 4. On the other hand, there are lots of things we seem to learn through observation and sense experience. For example, we're not born knowing how to ride a bike. We have to learn through trial and error. Or to get more philosophical about it, we have no idea of what a human being is without seeing and interacting with other human beings. If we were just a mind in a vacuum, how would we ever know that we were part of a human species, or even that there was a human species to be a part of? And those fancy mathematics we can learn, how did we start to learn that? Well, usually a grown-up put 2 of something in front of us, asked us to count, put 2 more things down, and asked us to count again. That's observation right there. That's sense perception. So these folks will say there's no inbuilt knowledge in us. We just learn to count by practice and observation until we've internalized it. It's worth noting that one particularly interesting avenue of research happening in cognitive psychology now concerns the acquisition of languages. Languages, of course, must be learned through hard trial and error, but as we study the brain, it does appear that infants have pre-built cognitive structures that help them internalize the rules of a language very, very quickly. So it might be that there's a little bit more middle ground than the philosophers realize. And it also might be one of the reasons why it can be easier to learn language as a kid. Don't wait until you're 35 to try and learn German. Now, Philo's sympathies are definitely more with the first group than the second. He is deeply influenced by Plato, and Platonists are generally very jazzed about the idea of innate ideas that people can just naturally know, because they think that's how people make use of the forms. After all, you can't empirically observe a form in the wild, you have to know it from the start. But Philo does think that the mind needs sense perception to kickstart its thinking. Even if I have ideas pre-built in my head, I can't really think them until the powers of sense perception start filling my head with content. Now, Philo has a lot of very interesting and very psychologically astute things to say about the relationship between mind and sense perception. He notes that God caused Adam to fall asleep before creating Eve. Why would he do this? It's not like God needed to give Adam an anesthetic before he took out a rib. No, it's to illustrate the relationship between mind and perception. When we are focused on what is outside us, we aren't focused on what's inside, and vice versa. Of course, we're always perceiving things outside us. Our nerves don't stop working just because we're busy thinking some really great thought. But we aren't always focusing our attention on those perceptions. Sometimes we are evaluating our choices, or thinking about what we'll have for dinner, or trying to comprehend the timeless and transcendent form of the good, how we'll stand up during the Last Judgment, etc., etc. Notice the temporal element to the mind as well. The mind can consider the past, the present, or the future, but we only perceive in the present. Philo notices that in his Bible, Adam cries out upon seeing Eve, "This now is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone." Philo asks, why say now? Why add that word in there? It's not like Eve was a Martian at first and then God transformed her into a human. She's always been human. Philo's answer is that sense perception lives in the now. Think of the now in that sentence not as an adverb but a noun. This now, this present moment of awareness, Adam recognizes as being a part of himself. Very profound. Also kind of sounds like something an overly enthusiastic yoga teacher might say. Philo appears to have mixed feelings about the role of perception. He acknowledges that it is one of God's marvelous and good creations. Without it, the mind would lose all capacity to function. Yet Philo also frequently admonishes his reader not to allow sense perception to win out over the mind. Philo worries that becoming trapped in the world of sense will leave the mind unable to function. It won't be able to understand God and the requirements of the virtuous life. And worst of all, sense perception is open to the temptations of the serpent. Yes, that's right, for now the tempter makes his entrance into the story. The twisted snake, more clever than any other creature, who symbolizes the great tempter himself, pleasure. Wait, I'm sorry, did you think I was going to say Satan? No, man. Pleasure is way more tempting than the devil. Far more temperamentally agreeable, too, and with fewer pointy edges. The association between snake and pleasure is a classic one. A snake's head is shaped like a phallus, and something about the seductive sibilance of its hiss suggests scandalous, secretive sins. Philo is hardly alone in seeing those connections. He gives a whole bunch of reasons why the snake symbolizes pleasure, but I'm going to skip them, because if we went through every reason Philo gave for every allegory he makes, this episode would be 15 hours long. You know how the story goes. The snake convinces Eve that eating the forbidden fruit is a great idea and is not going to backfire at all. It backfires immediately, and Adam and Eve realize they're naked and hide from God. Then God, the undefeated hide-and-seek champion of the universe since 15 million BC, finds them and proceeds to have a little chat before casting them out of Eden. Philo gives two pieces of insight here that I find intriguing. The first is that he reads Eve in a more positive light than many commentators of his day. You may remember that God asks Eve what she has done, and Eve replies that the serpent told her the apple was good, so she gave it to Adam. Many commentators, modern and ancient, have seen this as a classic case of passing the buck. Instead of owning up to the fact that she made a mistake, Eve blames the serpent and her husband. Philo disagrees. Eve is not avoiding responsibility because Eve is sense perception. What does sense perception do with whatever it finds? It presents it to the mind. Eve was just doing her job. That is why God does not reprimand her for avoiding responsibility. Philo also notes that in his Bible, Adam describes Eve as the woman you gave with me, not the woman you gave to me. Depending on the Bible translation you have, yours may say something like the woman you gave to me. Philo's Greek Bible did not. It said with me, not to me, and Philo thinks this is exactly right. Because sense perception is not entirely under the mind's control. It is not subservient to the mind, and there are times when we can't control what we notice around us. So for Philo, it is quite right to describe sense perception and Eve as an equal partner, not a slave or a pet that you can train. At which point you might be thinking, oh wow, Philo has a high view of Eve. It's so nice to see an ancient thinker with a more positive view of women. In which case, I have some bad news for you. Because Philo repeats a lot of misogynistic tropes in his writings. While sense perception isn't just the mind's servant, sometimes Philo wishes it was. He says the mind is supposed to be the active part of the self, sense perception the subservient part. When talking about the deceits of pleasure, Philo compares false pleasures to a man in love with an ugly woman. His love for her blinds him to her ugliness, and he incorrectly believes her to be beautiful. Not exactly the most respectful of comparisons. Philo scolds Rachel, Jacob's wife, for getting mad that he hasn't gotten her pregnant yet. This, he says, is typical of sense perception and its desire for immediate satisfaction. If she had stopped to think and remembered that it is God who opens and closes the womb, she would not have blamed her husband. And Miriam, the sister of Moses, is an example of shameless sense. She was angry that Moses had married a non-Jewish woman and let her displeasure be known about the camp of the Israelites, and God struck her with a skin disease until she apologized to her brother and her sister-in-law. So Philo, unfortunately, often sees women as paradigms of the bodily, the irrational, the emotional, the childish, and the sinful. And yet, there is another tendency in Philo too. For while he disparages Miriam, he praises Moses' wife in the same breath. He insists that this woman is a symbol of virtue, wisdom, and power, precisely because of her black skin. In a truly lovely line, Philo says that, quote, even as in the eye the part that sees is black, so the soul's power of vision has the title of Moses' wife, end quote. In other words, her black skin is like the pupil of the eye that sees in all, that takes in all, and also is unchanged. She symbolizes how the soul can be tried by the fires of temptation and come out unchanged and unshakable in its commitments. So in Philo's system, some women come off quite favorably, even women of color, today often the most maligned of all. Yet women are also often identified with some really not great stuff. How do we understand this? Well, we could spend a lot of time trying to sort out all the hypotheses. I'm just going to give you my best guess instead. Philo, you'll remember, really does not like the body. He will acknowledge that it is good because, as an observant Jew, he's bound to the decree of Genesis that the created world is good. But when Philo describes the body, he talks about it as a corpse, a prison, a distraction from the serious matters of the mind. Now, if what really matters in the human being is the mind and soul, then women have exactly the same capacity for spiritual growth and philosophizing as men do. Because none of the bodily differences between men and women matter. All that matters is that they're both human souls. That's why Philo can praise Moses' wife, or the women of the Therapeutai, or even let Eve off comparatively lightly. And yet, if women and men can reach the same end point, it's still true that women have farther to go, because they are more tightly bound to bodies and materiality than men are. Adam gets to symbolize mind, the best part of the human being. Eve is stuck in the middle, between mind and body. And women's bodies are, in Philo's mind, inevitably linked with pregnancy and childbirth. I will pause here to note that, of course, you need more than a female body for reproduction. In fact, in Philo's day, every single human to be born required the help of a male, with one rather notable exception. To make my government-mandated sports analogy for this episode, it's a bit like men and women are running a race, but the women start 50 meters behind the men. An exceptionally fast woman can beat men at the race, and when she does, she is praised for it, as she should be. But none of that changes the fact that women face a systemic disadvantage. I think that's kind of like what we have in Philo. He allows the possibility for women to win the race of the religious life, which is more than many others of his time did. He even celebrated women who did. But his ideas still viewed them as second-class citizens. Alright, that's enough late ancient misogyny for one episode. Let's get back to the bright and cheery history of humanity since the fall. Adam and Eve have two sons, Cain and Abel. This inaugurates one of the most important traditions in the book of Genesis, God favoring one child in a pair for no apparent reason. Abel and Cain both bring sacrifices to God. Abel's is accepted, Cain's is not, with rather bloody results. Later on in the family line, Jacob and Esau are born. Esau is the firstborn and therefore entitled to be the next head of the household and get a blessing and also all of Dad's stuff. But God's favor rests on Jacob. Jacob goes on to have 12 sons, and God appoints the second to youngest son, Joseph, to be leader over his brothers. What on earth is going on here? Well, thank God we have Philo to tell us, because nobody else can figure out why God keeps going for the non-obvious pick. In each of these pairs, the younger child symbolizes that which is spiritual and intellectual and just generally good, and the older child symbolizes the gross flesh prison of material existence. One such pair of children is Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Joseph. Philo notes that the name Manasseh means out of forgetfulness, while Ephraim's name means fruit-bearing. These two kiddos are clearly allegories for different kinds of memory. First, there is recollection, which is when you have to try really hard to recall something you were taught. Think about the process of learning a language. At first, you have to spend a lot of time remembering the rules of grammar. You even have to remember which letters make which sounds. But eventually, that all becomes automatic. It becomes true memory, the fruit of all your hard work. Since Ephraim's name means fruit-bearing, boom, he stands for true memory and is thus totally better than his brother. So there you have it, the mysteries of God's divine favorites, all laid bare. Anyway, all that was an aside Philo gave while commenting on the punishments of Adam and Eve as a result of the fall. You may have noticed Philo has a bit of a tendency to roam freely in his interpretations. This is the sort of thing that ancient Christians and Jews did all the time that drives modern scholars crazy. Nowadays, we are taught that it's irresponsible to compare one biblical text to another one that's written in a different time and place. But for Philo, and for most biblical scholars before, say, the year 1700, God was the ultimate author of the entire Bible. And they took it for granted that what was written in one book might be really important for interpreting a text in a very different time and place. You may think, though, that all of Philo's allegorizing can sound kind of deterministic. After all, if one kid is born to represent an inferior faculty, are they fated to be stuck there forever? Do we have an opportunity to grow or change or be blessed? The answer to that second question is unequivocally yes. One of the interesting things we see about Philo is that not all of his types or allegories are static and unchanging. One of my favorite cases of this is seen in the case of Joseph. Of course, Joseph is eventually a symbol of great power and virtue, but early in his life, it's a little different. You may remember that Joseph spends a number of years working as a slave for a powerful Egyptian named Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. Joseph resists, and Genesis writes that Joseph fled from this Egyptian woman. Now, according to Philo, Joseph was fleeing from the passions which were represented by this Egyptian. Philo says Joseph did this because he was immature. The mature man doesn't need to flee from temptation. He can face it head on. But the immature man doesn't have a full handle on his temptations yet. If he tries to fight every battle, he'll lose. So for those not sufficiently advanced yet, it's better to flee temptation altogether. There's a similar example with Moses. Moses, as you may guess, represents lots of good stuff. The soul rich in virtue and following God and leading people and conquering the passions and stuff. But it was not always so. Way back at the burning bush, Moses had a little crisis of faith in himself and worried that Pharaoh would not listen to him. So God teaches him through, and I know you'll be shocked to hear this, an allegory. God has Moses transform his rod into a serpent. Not for nothing does God choose a serpent, the very animal that deceived Adam and Eve. But God doesn't tell Moses to run from it. Instead, God says to grab it by the tail. Moses does, and it turns back into a rod. Philo's interpretation is worth quoting in full, so I quote, "This means don't let pleasure's opposition and savagery discourage you. No, this is the very part to grab for. Grab the tail and quell it. Then you'll have a rod, not a snake. Or instead of hedonism, you will have discipline in your hand. But it is in the hand, that is, in the wise man's actions, that this happens. It's impossible to grab hedonism and master it if the hand isn't stretched out. In other words, if the soul does not first acknowledge that all its achievements and successes are due to God's impelling force and not about itself. End quote. There's a humility in Philo. We are growing creatures, beset by sin, but capable of virtue and blessedness. There is no harm in acknowledging that we have room to grow. In fact, it's the only way to grow. And some things will never be outgrown. Philo goes out of his way to mention that we can never get away from our need for food, for example. Maybe the ascetic will limit their food intake, but one should never try to stop eating or sleeping. These things are necessary. So give the body what it needs and then get back to spiritual growth. And when you realize you have grown, then by golly, go out there, seize the serpents of evil by their tails, and turn them into the very instruments of righteousness. With that, we have come to the end of our discussion for today. What influence did Philo have on his audience with these massive commentaries? Well, among Jews, very little, actually. Unfortunately, the Jewish community in Palestine would get kicked out of the Roman Empire a few decades after Philo's death. In this time of disruption, they turned to their rabbis, the descendants of the Pharisees, to lead them. Those rabbis were less interested in allegorical interpretations of the law than how to fulfill that law in exile. It's nice to have some beautiful allegorical interpretation of the temple, but for most Jews in diaspora, the question was, if the Bible says I have to sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple, and the Jerusalem temple is burned to the ground and I can't go back there on pain of death, how on earth do I fulfill the commandments? So Philo's works, brilliant and voluminous as they were of little help in that brave new world. However, Philo was extremely influential to a new religious group making their way to Africa, the Christians. Christian thinkers found Philo's allegorizing interpretations of the law simpatico with their own theology, and they were fascinated by his hauntingly similar use of the Word of God, a phrase that paralleled the prologue of John. Indeed, John's Gospel itself may have been influenced by the work of this Alexandrine titan, but it would be another Gospel author who rubbed shoulders even more closely with Philo, the Apostle Mark, a native-born African according to tradition, and the very first apostle to follow along in Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.